Now recognizing the ranking member for opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono. Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes the lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm your host, Mary Bono, and I'm so happy you're here. On this podcast, I hope to bring you insightful conversations with a variety of guests from all walks of life, people with stories, wisdom, and perspectives that inspire and inform. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, and if you feel inspired, leave a 5-star rating. It helps us reach more listeners like you. Now let's dive into today's conversation. Welcome to this episode of Sagely Speaking. I'm going to get right to our guest, and I cannot wait to have this conversation. We have Admiral Eric Olson with us. I'm going to read a touch of his bio, but only a small touch because there's so much to it, and there's actually a lot to it that would never actually make it into the publication of a bio. But Eric Olson is a retired and very highly decorated United States Navy admiral who last served as the 8th Commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command, or also known as SOCOM. He served in that role from July 2nd of 2007 to August 8th of 2011, a position in which he oversaw all special operations forces of the U.S. military. He previously served as Deputy Commander at SOCOM from 2003 to July of 2007. And I have heard many times, and I know this from my experiences with him, people call him a quiet warrior, and I think you're going to hear that throughout this interview. So Admiral Olson was the first Navy SEAL ever to be appointed to 3-star and 4-star flag ranks, as well as being the first naval officer to be SOCOM's combatant commander. He has a total of 38 years of experience developing and leading high-performing teams under complex and dynamic conditions. And today, Admiral Olson is a thought leader in national security strategies, and he is known as a big idea innovator who leads meaningful transformations without trauma, fanfare, or backlash. Admiral Olson, I've been fortunate to spend some quality time with you and your wife, Marilyn. We have played golf together many a times. I think golf tournaments benefiting the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. We have done some wonderful hiking together in the Rocky Mountains. So with your permission, may I call you Eric?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Phew, I was sweating that one. So Eric, your service included significant operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially during the time when the U.S. Special Operations Forces were becoming increasingly prominent in global military engagements, especially the War on Terror. But I'd like to start picking your brain a little bit about the Battle of Mogadishu, if I can. That took place in 1993, which is pretty impossible to believe was 31 years ago. Can you please refresh our memory of what happened in Mogadishu?
Yeah, first, Mary, it's an honor to have been invited to do this and a real pleasure to be with you. And you did mention a personal connection, which extends, of course, to your husband, Steve, who was a Naval Academy classmate of mine before he went off to become a fighter pilot and an astronaut. So Marilyn and I have really enjoyed our time with you and Steve over the last years. And again, thank you for allowing me to join you for this.
Well, we're honored to have you.
To Mogadishu, it was 31 years ago, hard to believe, but there was a United Nations support effort in the country of Somalia, which was suffering through clan warfare, and the people were paying a price for that in sanitation, starvation, general health, and quality of life. And so the United Nations mission was established. And while the United Nations forces were there, a Pakistani force was ambushed at a road intersection by a clan leader, a warlord, named Muhammad Farah Aidid, the leader of the Habargidar clan. And so the United Nations mandate was to deal with Muhammad Farah Aidid for having killed a large number of Pakistani service members. And an American task force was designed to do that. And it deployed. I wasn't part of the initial deployment. Had just reported to the unit. I joined the force 2 or 3 weeks after they arrived in Mogadishu, Somalia. And then it became the hunt for Mohammed Farah Aidid. We never saw him. We never knew where he was for the weeks that we were there, so we started trying to pick away at what we called his lieutenants, the people who we thought might be able to show us or tell us where Mohammed Farah Aidid was hiding. And so there were a number of missions conducted. These were from an airport using helicopters to rapidly fly into a section of town to Mogadishu to put forces on the ground to capture the lieutenants and bring them back to the airfield where we were based. And ultimately, on one of those missions, 2 helicopters were shot down, and the story of Black Hawk Down became a well-known story in American lore. It was the largest fight that American forces had been in since Vietnam. So this was quite an experience for the force. I was obviously proud to be a member of that force, and I was able to be close witness to the enormous sacrifices, the enormous risk that people will take to protect and save their teammates. We witnessed 2 medals of honor, the actions that resulted in 2 medals of honor, both of them posthumously. Several people who put themselves at great personal risk for the protection of their teammates. But it was also sort of back at the strategic level, a reminder of how important it is to get your mission right up front, get your mission statement right. Our mission statement was to capture or kill Mohammed Farah Aidid as the clan leader. We never saw him. We never knew where he was. So by definition, it was a failed mission. If your only reason to be there is to capture or kill a person, and you can't find him, then obviously you're not accomplishing the mission you were sent to do. And looking back on it, if I could rewrite that, I didn't write the mission statement, but if I could have a hand in writing it, I would put in something about relieving the suffering and bringing stability to the people of Mogadishu and dealing with the clan warfare and the civil war that they were in. We had lots of capability to do that, but we were focused on one thing. And so it was an incident, a major incident in our military history. A Secretary of Defense lost his job over it. And I guess that's about it.
Well, it's hardly about it. And I do want to point out the fact that you were awarded the Silver Star Medal for Valor in Combat. Out of that, what I find interesting is that I believe from what I've read about you, you were about to take command of SEAL Team 6, and you were sent to be an observer of combat, and certainly weren't planning on experiencing what you did, the firefight that ensued. So I think a lot of, here you go, that silent warrior, and you've been also coined and called very humble, and you are, but I think to me, it just, obviously you went in with a mission, we went in with a mission as the United States, and all hell broke loose, and that contingency and the ability to adapt. And isn't that a forte of special forces, though, is that they really can adapt and think in real time and come up with solutions in real time? But we weren't quite there yet, or was this just the beginning of the SEAL teams really adapting into being a little bit more, willing to adapt or able to adapt in real time?
Yeah. First, I was sent to be a member of the staff, but as a learning experience, I wasn't sent to be a street fighter. But I did have some background in the Middle East and some language training that was useful. And so part of the rescue force was Malaysians and Pakistanis. And so I was initially assigned to be the liaison and then the leader of that force, going out into the streets. And that's what sort of brought me into it. And yes, special operations forces are known for their problem-solving abilities. They're kind of tactical problem solvers. And they're known as innovative, rightfully so, as adaptive, rightfully so. They tend to never own the mass or the terrain, so they have to figure out another way to get things done. And this, because it was the sort of the largest fight that anybody had seen for a while, required a lot of adapting. And of course, we were adapting sort of in areas that we couldn't go except to conduct the missions. We were operating off an airfield, and so everything we did was an excursion from that. And that means that your intelligence is always insufficient. So most of the adapting actually was at the soldier level inside his close perimeter. He had to make things happen.
Now, you are recognized for your contributions to special operations strategy and tactics, as well as for the emphasis on the role of spec ops in a variety of military operations. And you sent me a paper, and I was reading this all day yesterday intently, studying as if I was taking a final exam with you today. And I finally had this epiphany. Why don't we just talk about your paper and go through the points that you would like to hit? I think they are very important, and I think they're timely. And I know this article was published not too long ago, so I think that it's still very, very relative. But your paper is called The Tools of Influence and Access, SOCOM and SOF, Special Operations Forces, War Around the Edges. So can you tell us what compelled you to put pen to paper and write this article?
Yeah, first, thanks for reading it, Mary. It was published in a law journal. It's not something that people would typically want to get, plow through. And I've been retired now more than 13 years. Went by like a long weekend, but it's 13 years, and I've pretty much stayed out of the public eye for most of that time. I've written only a few things and published fewer than that. But a few years ago, 3 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about how special operations forces would reorient themselves from the fights in Iraq and Afghanistan to a new national policy, national defense strategy that highlighted near-peer adversaries like China and Russia. And what was the role of special operations in that kind of a fight, an industrial strength, metal on metal fight? And how do you use small teams to do that? And there was discussion as part of that about changing what special operations forces were, from a combatant command to a military service, and giving the commander of the Special Operations Command a seat alongside the service chiefs among the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that inspired me to write something about it. Nobody asked for my opinion. I mean, the editor of the law journal asked me if I would do something, but I wasn't asked to be an advisor to any on this. But I just felt like, since I had some experience, I'd write it down. And if anybody wanted to read it, that they could do it. So I wrote that article, and it was really about, how do you think about the use of special operations forces in a war different from the one that they'd been in for almost 20 years at that point.
And you mean Iraq and Afghanistan?
Iraq and Afghanistan, small teams, widely dispersed, working closely with locals in many cases, particularly in Afghanistan, very much in support of conventional service operations. And I thought that as we began to rethink potential war with China, it really is at some point in the future, if it comes. And in the meantime, we are fighting what I call war around the edges. It's the economic domination, it's political intimidation, it's cyber warfare, it's being a neighborhood bully, it's encroaching on other people's territorial claims. And I thought there's a real important use for special operations forces in the war around the edges. Hopefully that will delay, deter, prevent a larger war. And that's the forte of the special operations forces. They like to say they run to the sound of guns, but it's important, at least as important, to run ahead of the sound of guns and try to prevent that sound from occurring. And so the idea is, what can we do in the Western Pacific and Eastern Asia to help address this war around the edges that China is fighting with us?
You seeing some of that with what we're doing in Ukraine, or is this entirely different?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Are we doing some of this with Ukraine? Clearly, we're not actually theoretically in the fight, right? But we are doing everything we can. You talk about psychological warfare, the unconventional warfare, the counterinsurgency. So there's a lot to all of these things. Somehow we've effectively, for the most part, stayed out. Yet we're trying to exert as much influence as we can. We're trying to go to the end of our chain and bark, so to speak, and do all that we can. And it's interesting right now because the feeling with the American people is, wait, these are not our problems anywhere.
Yeah, but they may not be our immediate direct problems, but if they're global problems, they become our problems. Like it or not, the world is getting more globalized. Sovereignty doesn't mean exactly what it used to. Territorial sovereignty can be protected, but informational sovereignty and economic sovereignty and social sovereignty, those don't exist the way they once did, as transportation and communications have changed so rapidly. Yeah, so successor of mine at Special Operations Command used a phrase I like. He said that what Special Operations could do was help turn Eastern European countries. At the time he said it was before Ukraine, but it would include that, into porcupines that the Russian bear can't swallow. And I think you can say the same thing in East Asia, turn the border and near border countries of China into porcupines that the Chinese dragon can't swallow. And there's a lot that we can do to help with that. There's military training kinds of efforts, there's equipping efforts, there's just advise and assist in a variety of ways, kind of efforts that will help them become tougher for China to deal with in East Asia and Russia to deal with in Eastern Europe and South Asia. But it does require a different kind of a force than most people think of the military as being. It requires one that has language skills, one that can work in very small teams in remote places, that has a small logistics tail that can live by its wits. And those are fortes of the Special Operations Forces.
I think people are well aware of that now. The successes and, and some struggles, or whether it's a television series or whether books that are written, I think people are pretty clear about what our warriors are doing, the tip of the spear in naval special warfare. I think people understand that, which is really, really refreshing. But I think that they don't understand, and I don't know that they need to from this podcast, but the structure of it all. And you've talked about elevating, to the equal of the branches. And I think that there's a lot to talk about there. And I'm sure maybe in the halls of Congress they are, or maybe they've got their plates full with other issues.
Well, first,
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you, please.
First, by watching the books and the movies reading the books and watching the movies and the television shows, they see one side of the Special Operations Forces. They tend to see the dramatic, kinetic side where missions are accomplished with great action. They don't see the other side of Special Operations Force, which actually is most of the work. It's working with people in places to accomplish things that are never, that aren't exciting or dramatic, but they're important. And most of the Special Operations forces who are deployed on most days are working in very small teams with counterparts, just to help them get better at what they do, and we learn a lot along the way.
And the special operators were born in World War II, correct? But then evolved. It was the OSS. Yep. My dad was a World War II veteran, so I tend to harp on all things World War II. Yeah. But I do like to think how much of this was born out of that. I believe at that time, I believe in your paper you talk about this being usually, first they weren't American GIs who were doing this work, but they did have to recruit other assets.
Yeah, the modern day U.S. Special Operations Forces were born out of the Office of Strategic Services, which was a World War II entity which brought together operational forces and intelligence capabilities, a lot of behind-the-lines work by the OSS, but it was closed down soon, just as World War II ended. It only lasted 3.5 years and only had one commander. But 2 years later, the CIA was established address the intelligence side, and the Army Special Warfare was established a few years later, 7 years later, to address the sort of the military operational side. It was based on morale operations called psychological operations, try to address the enemy's morale through communications, and it was also based on insurgency warfare, which is supporting insurgents against an illegitimate government, and on counterinsurgency, which is supporting a legitimate government against those who are trying to overthrow it. Those were the three pillars, the original pillars of the Army Special Warfare Community, which is the core of the now Special Operations Community, established by law, much larger, big thing the United States Special Operations has become. And by the way, I didn't say it up front, so let me say for the record that I do not believe that United States Special Operations Command should become a military service. I think that would not be an elevation, but actually a demotion from its current status.
We'll continue with our interview in a moment, but first I'd like to thank my sponsors. Lucy Pet Foods is the leader in gut health. Their formulas for life feature prebiotic, balanced fiber that nourishes your dog and cat's total health. Every purchase helps support the Lucy Pet Foundation, a 501c3 charity helping animals. Save 15% off your first order and use the promo code SAGELYSPEAKING, all one word, and you will get free shipping at lucypetfoods.com. If you're committed to tackling the opioid and addiction crises, then you need to be at the 2025 RX Summit. Use code SAGELY, that's SAGELY, for an extra $100 off. Join top experts and professionals as we share strategies for prevention, deflection, treatment, and recovery. Don't miss this chance to be part of the change. Head over to rx-summit.com to register now. That's rx-summit.com for an additional $100 off. Mothers for Awareness and Prevention of Drug Abuse, driving solutions to prevent drug abuse and overdose deaths by focusing on prevention through education and awareness. And now, back to our interview.
One thing that intrigues me, and I think intrigues all of us, civilian laymen, is the people of the Special Operations Forces. They're not normal. There's something above and beyond, right? I think if you think of stories, and as you know, I have a relative who's an active duty SEAL, and you've met him, and then family member who has passed away as a SEAL. But it takes, and I look at you, it takes such, I don't know what it takes. And I remember asking you on our hike, what do you look for when you're trying to recruit SEALs and whittle down the numbers? And you told me, we look for wrestlers and chess players. And
Well,
I don't know if you remember telling me that, but I thought,
yeah,
wow,
no,
I can
I'll
do
tell you,
those things.
I'll tell you the story. We tried hard to figure out if we could improve the success rate of SEAL trainees. We lose about 75% in the training process, about 6 months long.
75% you
About
lose.
75%. But everybody who comes in the front door is qualified to graduate. They've been recommended. They've passed a physical fitness test. They're prepared. They should graduate. But on graduation day, only 25% are still there. So we tried hard to see if we could figure out sort of how to better pre-select, and we failed completely. We did survey, to your point, we did survey the people who were leaving, and let me start. We surveyed the people who were successful, and what we found was that in the category of sort of hobbies and pastimes, the two best indicators of success were having been a water polo player or a wrestler at the high school or collegiate level. To your point, though, we also learned that if you happen to be a chess player, your chances of success tripled. And we sort of realized that chess players are not in the moment. They're thinking more moves ahead. And interestingly, we also surveyed people who were leaving the program, and we weren't surprised to verify that 75% were leaving. We weren't surprised to statistically note that most of the ones who left because they wanted to. They quit. And make it easy to quit. You ring a bell, drop your helmet on the ground, walk out the door, and nobody invites you back. And what we were surprised to learn was when people quit. They didn't quit in the middle of something hard. They quit in anticipation of something hard. They tended to quit mostly after breakfast and after lunch. And they'd look at the rest of the morning schedule or look at the afternoon schedule and say, I'm not sure I can do that. That's really hard. I have to run the obstacle course twice, or I have to swim 5 miles, or I have to run 14, whatever it is, and they don't know if they can do it. And so just the little armchair psychologist in me says that these are people who are removing themselves from a situation in which they might fail, because it's easier to explain that than to actually fail. And so if you think about it, those correlate. Chess players aren't thinking about the next thing. They're thinking next week or next month, or what's it going to be like after I finish this? And I'm working in a SEAL team, and as a result, not much was changed. The attrition rate is still 75%, and we kind of decided that if someone's going to be afraid to take on something really hard because they think they might fail, it's better to learn that in a controlled training environment than when lives and missions are on the line. So if they want to quit, we let them, and that's the number one thing, is just don't quit. Once you realize that the instructors are not allowed to intentionally maim you or kill you in the training process, you just have to not quit. And that's the 25% who make it through.
Which in itself is so different. I'm looking at you, remembering taking a big hike with you, and you were sprinting up the hill, and I'm like on the fourth switchback going, I'd really like to turn back now. So I think that difference of sticking through the hard stuff, and, athletes do that, elite athletes, a lot of folks can do that. But what about character? How do you assess character for the people who are going through BUDS or the people who are serving in active duty?
Yeah, I mean, it tends to take care of itself. The people who have that stick-to-itiveness tend to be people who are focused importantly on what it is they want to do, and they tend to want to do it for the right reasons. It's not flawless, but for many, many years, we didn't do any kind of psychological studies or any of that of the people getting through. We didn't, because we were pretty happy with the product that was coming out the back end. I did hear a colleague say some years ago, and I thought it was pretty profound. He said the SEALs weren't the bullies in high school. They were the kids who were defending against the bullies in high school. And I think that's probably pretty true. That the motto of the Army Special Forces is "De oppressor libera," free the oppressed, and that's really what the culture of the community is to take our abilities and work on behalf of those who need our help.
And then, Eric, you sent another article to me. I believe you didn't have it published, and if we're free to talk about, you talked about using the Sinai Peninsula as a solution for the refugee problem.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm a pessimist. It seems to me these skirmishes and these issues and these conflicts, we just kick the can down the road, or it's basically the same underlying problem, just a different area of the world, usually the Middle East. But can you unpack this, what you think we would accomplish by doing this, and how realistic is it?
I don't know how realistic it is. The reason it wasn't published is because I gave it to a few people to read, and they sort of gave it back. But and I wrote it 8 years ago. It was actually during the first Syrian refugee crisis. Everybody remembers the dead boy, the boy who washed up on the beaches of Turkey, and the girl who got caught in the barbed wire around Hungary. And the Syrian refugees were paying a high price to try to get into Europe in their civil war. And the gist of my article was based on a comment that is attributed to Hubert Humphrey, who, when he was vice president, toured the Sinai and said, this would be a great place for the world to fight all of its wars. Countries should just send their forces here and fight them in the Sinai, and the winner wins. And that way, innocent civilians don't get hurt. It has mountains, it has beaches, it has, surrounded by water. It's a great arena. The Sinai could be a great arena for war. And I thought, instead of fighting wars there, why don't we allow refugees to build a life there? And if they would go there and be diverted there or taken there, and they had a world of support. The Egyptians, of course, would have to be the main supporters because they own the Sinai, but it could be an international effort to build large camps, and not just camps, but factories and offices and production centers, and schools and universities, and allow for a waiting and training period for migrants and refugees to get reoriented to a new kind of life, and take the time to then help them get somewhere else, either to rejoin family or communities where they would be supported somewhere else in the world. And that would relieve countries who are being overwhelmed by migrants and refugees from having to deal with them, and it would provide the migrants and the refugees themselves a chance to learn and support. And in theory, this could actually become an economic zone, and with robust manufacturing efforts. Why couldn't you build silicon chips there? Why couldn't you build automobiles there? And it would be expensive and hard, but no more expensive and no harder than the global problem that we're dealing with. So anyway, that's why I wrote that. That's why I wrote that. And now, having seen what the Palestinian refugees from Gaza, who could just walk across the border into the northern Sinai, it seems to me, selfishly speaking, as an opportunity lost.
You talk again about what it would take: diplomacy, engagement, collaboration between NGOs, government organizations. It takes a lot. In the federal government and the state of California, we have empowerment zones and enterprise zones. And it's dissimilar in the fact that it's not refugees, but it is about impoverished areas. sometimes rural, sometimes, in the center of a city. What do we do? How do we incentivize growth here and bring the people up? And it seems like a pretty interesting model to replicate. However, the international players, and I know you've done a lot, the diplomatic efforts, you've integrated and faced with a lot of those folks, but I haven't. And I can only imagine. You not only talk about chess players, I hear you use the word multi-dimensional chess. So you want chessboard on top of chessboard on top of chessboard, and you want to see everything being played in the multidimensional. But I think it's a great idea because it's not a problem that's going to go away. And I think just having the conversation as a starting place, of course, I don't know what Egypt would say and what they're saying now to the folks from Gaza, but I think it has to be elevated, this conversation, on what do we do, or how often do we kick this can down the road, have humanitarian crises. And it doesn't take a lot to stop to think about how lucky we are not to be in that environment. I'm so superstitious, so I'm knocking on wood, but I do hope you continue this conversation and elevate it and have more with your colleagues and your peers.
And
But
it would also allow the Arab world to take a leadership role in addressing a problem that is largely a Middle Eastern problem. And they could do it with money, not with forces. Just they could be the economic power behind such an enterprise.
How do you get them to get beyond the sex, SECTS, the sex, the sectarian nature of the Islam world, the Muslim world? And sometimes you can't even keep it all straight, what's happening. So how do you fix that on this multidimensional chessboard?
Well, obviously it would take leadership and statesmanship in that part of the world, but I think actually you could probably make it a good business proposition as well.
Some buy-in, that would be great. Now, I want to just, before I lose you, and thank you for your very precious time, I did want to ask you a little bit more about your life in itself and why the Naval Academy.
Yeah. I grew up in Tacoma, Washington. I didn't have a military bone in my body. Nobody in my family ever served. But the first semester of my junior year of high school, I found myself in Washington, D.C., and it was the height of the Vietnam War. And the largest Vietnam protest ever in the fall of 1967 was a few blocks from where I was living. I walked over there. And when I got back home, I said to my mother, I was 15, I said to my mother, I don't necessarily align myself with what they're doing, but I'm really proud to live in a country where that can happen within eyesight of the nation's capital and the president's house. And with malice aforethought, I think she drove me up to the Naval Academy, a half hour away, 3 weeks later, and it happened to be the day that all of the midshipmen were out of town to the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. So I didn't see any midshipmen. I just saw green grass and blue sky and white clouds and sailboats on the bay. And I asked somebody how much it cost to go there, and they said nothing. We pay you, and so I ended up applying to 2 colleges, and the other one didn't accept me. So I found myself being sworn in as a midshipman in the Naval Academy just before I turned 17 and a half years old. And I realized while I was there that, I really wasn't a very military guy. And this is cliche as can be, so forgive me, but I didn't want to serve in a part of the Navy where you man the equipment. I wanted to be in a part of the Navy where they would equip the man. And so I started looking at the smaller parts of the Navy, the Seabees and the explosive ordnance disposal. And I was a hobbyist scuba diver, so I started looking at the underwater demolition teams and the SEAL teams, which were just coming into America's consciousness back. They were only 5 years old at that point. And I was intrigued by that. So very fortunate to have had the opportunity to pursue that coming out of the Naval Academy. I was in a serious automobile accident 3 days after I was selected for SEAL training, and I want to give the Naval Academy and the Navy full credit for not canceling my orders to SEAL training. The doctors thought that I wouldn't be able to recover to make it, but the Naval Academy said that's not a decision we're going to make. We'll let Eric decide whether or not he can make it. And so I was able to do that, and I'm forever thankful to the Navy for not quitting on me, and probably is, at least in part, that's why I never quit on them. And because I sure didn't plan to stay more than 5 years when I first joined. So a great opportunity, and I feel fortunate to have been allowed to serve in the ways they let me.
It's interesting. I think about you and my husband, who always had wanted to go to the Naval Academy. He always wanted to be a naval aviator. The astronaut career came after, or while he was, I think, a test pilot. Very different sort of approaches into going to the Naval Academy. But I'm a little younger than you, and so I wasn't of the age of the draft age, or my brother was, but my classmates and peers were not. But I'm amazed of people who say, look at the protests are huge. They are vast. We know about them. We know them in our collective psyche. Great songs have been written about that era. Yet people still signed up for the Naval Academy or all the service academies. And I don't know if that was courage. Like you said, you wanted to defend the country. You allowed people to go ahead and protest in front of the White House and the Capitol building. But it must have taken something special to just say, everybody else, do what you're going to do, but I'm going to do my own thing, and I'm going to Naval Academy. How did you work through that? How do you tell your friends and your peers when they're...
Well, you're right. It was an unpopular time to go into military service, and the draft was active then. I turned 18 after I was already in uniform, so the draft wouldn't have affected me, but it wouldn't have affected me anyway. My draft number was 330 something, so I never would have been called, but it all worked out. Frankly, the fact that it was an unpopular time to go in the military worked for me because the competition in my congressional district was less severe. I was a very average student and an average athlete in high school, and somehow I managed to get an appointment to the Naval Academy. My own congressman wouldn't appoint me. He sent 5 names to the Naval Academy for the Dean of Admissions to select from. He selected me number 2, but number 1 failed his physical. So just, more fortune, just my life and career filled with serendipity. I believe what Louis Pasteur said, which is chance favors the prepared mind. And another friend of mine says that luck is the intersection of readiness and opportunity. So you have to be ready. But I also know that I was quite fortunate many times in many ways through the course of my career.
Well, that's interesting. I think about when I was in Congress, I had the honor of being able to nominate students, high school students, for the academies. And I think there's no greater honor that I remember from my career. And I had a panel who helped, so I never got to hand select children of friends or anything like that. A great panel of folks, some who listen to this podcast, and I want to thank them still. But great pride in the people you get to nominate, and then you follow their careers, and some stay in for a long time and some don't. My God, that was an amazing opportunity as a member of Congress. And believe it or not all members of Congress actually promote Academy Day. Not all promote to their constituents that there is even this opportunity. And I won't name names, but some members just do nothing about it. But a couple of last things, if I might. I know that you teach on occasion now, and I don't know if it's warfare or leadership or the combination of both or what. But what are you seeing in future generations in leadership and their interest in geopolitics and threats to our country? Are you optimistic?
I am, but also it's, the people I'm teaching are already heading that way. I taught a graduate course at Columbia University for a few years, and occasionally I'll teach at Syracuse or Texas or someplace else. But the people I'm talking to are students who are headed towards some sort of government service. They're going to work for the United Nations or NATO or Department of Defense or a Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something, and that's how they see themselves. So this is already a group that has selected that, and they tend to be really quality people who are thoughtful. They're much more aware of global things than I was at that age. I think they're much more aware of themselves and where they might fit in than I was at that age. Where I was struggling was mostly frankly, in their ability to write down what they think. And communications now, in general, tend to be brief. Social media, quick notes, that sort of thing. And so the idea of defending a position in a concise and compelling way is not something that most people have grown up doing. And I find when I was teaching a full 14-week course, I found that it was, frankly, as much a writing course as it was a content course, because I had to go in with the assumption that these people, in whatever job they were in, were going to be advisors or staff members who would be asked to research, analyze, state, and defend a position. But I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful, very encouraged. I like to say that, the people who have lost their faith in America's youth, they're not seeing the same youth I'm seeing, whether it's either the ones I worked with in the military or the ones I'm seeing now in my incursions into academia. And frankly, that's the reason I'm in academia. When I was leaving military service, I thought about what I would miss, and what kept coming to the top of the list was engagement with quality young people. I had an enormous opportunity and great pleasure of working with so many enormously talented young people over the course of my career that I wanted to find some way to recapture some of that. And that's why I started teaching.
Another way I know you've given back is that for a handful of years you were CEO, and this is the last thing we'll close on because you've been, again, so generous with your time. CEO of, or chairman of the board, of the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. Call it Soft Warrior Foundation. And can you talk about the importance of organizations like this and what they do to support our special operators or any military? Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a proliferation of military, veteran, family-oriented charities, particularly since 9/11. There are 10 or 20 times as many now as there were then. And it's largely because there has been a real need for them. They're not all wonderful, but many, many are and are worth supporting. I think that the military pretty much stepped up to the plate to help the wounded or the traumatized service veteran. But it's mostly up to charitable organizations to deal with caregivers, with family, many of whom have had to change their lives in significant ways to take care of seriously wounded, mentally or physically wounded veterans, or to take care of the children and families left behind by those who have fallen. And that's what the Special Operations Warrior Foundation does. It's particularly focused on the children left behind. And its goal is to reach out to every surviving spouse and offer her or him the opportunity for their kids to get through college, and whatever age that is. And in some cases, they're not even born yet. It's a commitment for 18 or more years to get those kids through college. So it's a mentorship program, it's a training program, it's a college application assistance program, and then it's a tuition assistance program. And they're enormously successful at what they do. They get about more than 90% of the kids into college, and more than 90% of those graduate. And I don't know of any other demographic that has that high a success rate getting into either college or trade schools. It's post-secondary education or training. And so this one is particularly focused on the special operations community, and that's where my heart was. So I served on the board and then as chairman for a while. I'm an emeritus now.
I think it's a great way for listeners or viewers, for those who are watching us on YouTube, but for them to contribute and to give back. And it's, again, Special Operations Warrior Foundation. You can Google it, just so I don't mess up the acronym for the website, but Special Operations Warrior Foundation. We support it. We're huge believers in it. And we're also grateful that it exists, and appreciate the leadership that you had given and that continues to this day. So in closing, Admiral Olson, I just wanted to thank you, but also thank your wife, Marilyn, for her years with you during your service and your deployments. And when I look at your history, you didn't serve in a whole lot of garden spots in the world. So I know Marilyn was an excellent partner and lived through so much with you at that time. So to you and to Marilyn, we're forever grateful for your service. And I know it sounds trite, but we do want to thank you for your service to our country.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you for mentioning that. And my counsel to the young special operations warriors who are considering getting married is to make sure they found a woman stronger than they are, because we always knew where we were, what we were doing, who we were with, and our spouses had to take that on faith. and it's tough to do that and raise a family at the same time. So thank you for hats off to all the military spouses out there. They freed us up to do what we did.
What a great way to end. So again, Admiral, I just called you Admiral Oswald.
Eric. Yeah, so I won't
Admiral
call you
Oswald.
I won't call you the honorable if you won't call me the admiral. And no, thanks very much. Really, really a pleasure to be with you, Mary, and thanks for all you do. You got your head in the game and continuing to do these podcasts, and from your perch at 9,000 feet in the Colorado mountains, you've still got a real good view of the world. So thank you.
Thank you. And hope to see you soon, whether we're hiking, fishing, playing golf, whatever it will be. But look forward to more of those great times. But I'd like to thank our listeners, too, for joining us today. I hope you found today's episode as fascinating as I did. To our sponsors, thank you very much for your continued support, for without you, we couldn't do what we do and have people like Admiral Eric Olson on. So until we meet again, we just want to wish you all the best and encourage you to stay well.